Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 211. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, March the 13th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Before we start with our guest today, Drew Smith, a social entrepreneur, I want to give you an update. I haven't done this in a little bit on the restoration project with the Jaguar, 1951 Jaguar Mark 7 that my father, my brothers, my kids, and I are working on. Progress has been slow, I will say that, for two reasons. Reason number one, the weather. While I do have a nice shop to work in, it's not a heated shop. And while I do have a small heater for that shop, it bumps the temperature up about 10 degrees. So the day that I finally got brave enough to go in there and work on it on a Saturday morning when it was 12 degrees outside, the heater was, it raised it to a balmy 22 degrees in the shop. So it was difficult to work on. Also, let's just say the low-hanging fruit has been picked. So now we're in into the difficult part. We're into the parts with the frozen bolts, the hard to get to things. I will say that I am breaking off more bolts than I'm taking out. Okay. Sometimes you just have to take a cold chisel and just cut everything out. So, so its progress has been slow. After the podcast, one of my brothers and I are going to work on it for a little bit today. So slow but sure progress on the Jaguar restoration project. My guest today, as I mentioned before, his name is Drew Smith. He's a social entrepreneur. He's worked in manufacturing for years. He now owns his own businesses, and in his spare time has been to 3 continents and the North St. Louis area, working with the extremely poor folks. Drew, welcome to the James Strong Show podcast.
Well, thank you, James. I'm glad to be with you.
I wanted to have you on. We have our mutual friend, Kieran Gutting, who's been on the podcast in the past. And he mentioned you, and he even sent me an article that you wrote. The initial article had to do with the Heroes Mandate that they put in Long Beach City a while back in the L.A. area, whereas the city said, look, you got to pay your employees $4 an hour more. You got to pay them heroes pay because they've worked during the pandemic. And in theory, something like that, like the $15 an hour minimum wage, sounds wonderful. I mean, you need to pay the poor more. If you pay them more, you'll get them out of poverty. But there's all kinds of problems with that. That's what we'd like to talk about today. So first of all, give me a little bit about your background, where you're coming from, what you've done, and how you got from point A to where you are today.
Well, thank you, James. I'll be real brief on that. My background is I'm an engineer. I went to work for multiple companies. I eventually started my own, which led to participate in ownership of several businesses. But also in the last several decades, I spent quite a bit of my time on 3 different continents, Asia, Africa, and Central South America, working with the ultra poor to try to help them stand on their own feet. And as a result of that, I also asked myself the question, why couldn't this work in my own country, my own city of North St. Louis? So I began working in North St. Louis with the church up there to try to identify ways that we could help folks living in ultra poverty there stand on their own feet. And my perspective here in this whole issue of minimum wage is really from the perspective of how can we best benefit the ultra poor? And I know the intent here is to try to help the poor. Unfortunately, what people miss in the discussion of minimum wage is what forcing the market to set a fixed price for wages has a disproportionate negative effect on the ultra poor. And that may seem a little backwards, but the reality is, if you're an employer and you're now told you have to pay $15 an hour at a minimum, you're now going to say to yourself, why would I take a chance on someone who isn't as skilled in both the hard skills of what I need to get the job done and the soft skills of how to perform in the workplace? Instead, I'll hire folks who may have more background, who may have more training or education, who maybe aren't landing jobs that are paying in the past as much as $15 an hour. So I'll have, folks with college degrees working at Starbucks and McDonald's who were able to, that's $30,000 a year. They maybe with a, degree that didn't bring a lot of technical expertise, find that that's better than they can make otherwise. And what that leaves out are people who need the initial job experience. The ultra poor, teenagers, people working their first job. You've now limited how many of those kind of folks can participate in the marketplace.
Well, and you talk about the ultra poor, and just so because we have a lot of people who are not in East Central Missouri, they may or may not know, but the North St. Louis area of this region is by far the poorest. It's always been the poorest part of the area. So people say, well, North St. Louis, what's the difference between North and South St. Louis? The North St. Louis area has been traditionally the poorest area. So just so folks know. And that's the thing about working. You talked about soft skills. You talked about hard skills. It's one thing to be able to be a tradesman, to be able to work on fix an automobile, to be able to upholster a car, to be able to change a tire. That's one thing. But sometimes, based on background, we take a lot for granted. We were discussing earlier, just showing up at 7:00 every morning is necessary. Andy Warhol, I think, was the one. I'm paraphrasing, but he said, showing up is 50% of the job, and that's really true. If you don't show up on time, the employer can't use you.
Yeah, that's right, James. And what I discovered working with the ultra poor is that in the culture that they have experienced, they're living for the moment. The crisis of the moment drives their life. So if the car breaks down, they're going to focus on fixing the car, not going to work. And they don't understand that when it comes to work, if they're going to succeed during working hours, work has to be their first priority. And what often happens is they sleep too late, they miss the bus, they show up late for work, they say to the boss, well, I missed the bus. So, and they're inferring in that conversation that it's okay to take their problem and impose it on someone else. And what they don't understand is after 5 or 6 times doing that, they lose their job because they aren't at work on a regular basis. And what I've experienced is they then begin to develop a history of feeling like, well, the boss doesn't like me, whatever. They don't understand that the consequence of their own actions is what drives their success or failure.
And quite often when you have a person like that, and I've heard people be critical of people like that. Well, don't they know they have to show up to work every day? Well, that type of skill, like anything else, has to be taught. And the answer is maybe nobody ever told them you have to show up every day.
Yeah, James, that's a lot of it. Absolutely. And what we found to help those kind of folks succeed is that they need, many people say, well, they just need a job. And I cringe when I hear that, because it's not just handing them a job. It's handing them the soft skills that allow them to succeed in that job. And that's what's missing. Actually, the hard skills, the technical skills are the easiest to teach. And those are well structured, and there's lots of training programs, both employers and unions and others have, to train people in that. But if they don't show up for the training, they can't get the training, they can't get the job.
Right.
And so those soft skills are the most critical. And again, if you artificially increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour, you're going to block out a lot of those folks who employers will say, why should I incur the cost of having to develop someone to just show up for work and the other important soft skills in performing at work if I can hire someone who has more education, who maybe comes from a middle-class environment, who already understands the culture of work and the important characteristics that allow you to succeed. And they're going to lock out a large quantity of the ultra poor who won't be able to get that chance. And it might be interesting, James, if I can divert a little bit, just talk about some facts around the minimum wage.
Please do.
Are often missed.
Please do.
I read a statement that, when the political leaders said there's $15 an hour minimum wage, will give 27 million people a raise, 70% of them women. Well, the facts are that only about 13% of workers that would be affected live in poor households. 2/3 live in households with incomes over twice the poverty line, and over 40% live in households with incomes over 3 times the poverty line. Most of the workers who earn the minimum wage today are not a family sole breadwinner. The picture they're trying to paint politically is that it's single moms. 70% of these are single moms who live in poverty, and this will lift them out of poverty and give women this great chance. Well, most workers earn minimum wage are not the sole breadwinner. They tend to be teenagers living at home or senior citizens working part-time to stay busy in retirement. Single mothers make up less than 5% of those who potentially would benefit from a minimum wage hike. And I'm reading all this from a Wall Street Journal editorial written by Jason Riley over the last month that gives some really good information here.
Why? No. Do you? This is amazing. I mean, did these people did they massage the numbers, or did they just flat out lie?
Well, I can't read into other people's hearts and minds. My only interest here is in representing the ultra poor and helping them succeed.
Understood.
And unless we're armed with the facts, we can't help anybody. Mm-hmm. The fact is that most minimum wage earners aren't impoverished. And if you look at one of the things that entry level, people call them minimum wage jobs, I call them entry level jobs. And that's an important distinction, because most of us, James, probably you also, started off making minimum wage, and the purpose of that job was to learn how to work.
That's things like that's 100% true.
What happens if you don't show up on time? Oh, gee, I learned that's a problem.
Yeah.
My very first minimum wage job, I showed up late for work the first day.
Yeah.
And got a clear message from my boss, that doesn't cut it. And that was an important lesson I had to learn.
Well, and you're 100% right. The first job I had, and maybe this is showing my age, was at a restaurant when I was a teenager, 16 years old in high school, Sambo's Restaurants, which are closed right now. And I earned $1.90 an hour.
Well, I got you beat. I earned $1.10 at my first job.
There you go.
And I'm going to put forth a premise that sounds backwards, but increased minimum wage laws make inequality worse, because low-income minorities stand to lose the most from lifting the wage floor, because they're overrepresented in the less skilled and less experienced workforce. So let me say that again. Minorities and the ultra poor are overrepresented in the less skilled and less experienced workforce.
Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, then why wouldn't $15 an hour minimum wage help them?
Because they won't qualify for that. The folks I work with in North City, when I first started working for them, weren't worth $4 an hour initially. They didn't understand how to show up for work. Living in poverty, one of the key differences between that and growing up in middle class is your response to stress. Mm-hmm. Growing up in poverty, your response to stress is fight or flight. You've probably heard that expression.
Sure.
And how that plays out in the workplace is when stress hits, and I saw this myself, we started a landscaping business to provide a place to train our folks that we were teaching, give them some supervised work experience, reinforce what we're trying to teach them. Mm-hmm. And when stress hit on the job, their first response was to yell at me. And then the second response was to stomp off. And after 3 or 4 of those, we got them to come back and talk through it and understand that's not a healthy response. Healthy responses are a third option, which is let's negotiate through the issue. What do you need? What do I need? How do we find a common ground? Those kind of things. And those things just aren't a part of someone growing up in ultra poverty. There's interesting also a little bit of history about minimum wage and some of its origins that people don't get. The federal government got involved in setting minimum wage levels back in the 30s. Mm-hmm. really the urging of unions that at that point